Why is Africa still poor? I would like to start by asking you to remember these three issues, which I might not answer, but at the end of the day I wanted to carry them with you. Why are we talking about development countries versus industrial countries? Why are we talking about development countries versus industrial countries? Who defines what is development aid and what is good development? Who defines that? Who has the power to tell us when they analyze, when they pass judgment of good or bad? Rank these countries in income per capita in 1960. Ghana, Somalia, South Korea. It's actually ranked there already. And rank them in 2013. Okay, this is the backdrop. Good development is about sharing resources to meet everybody's basic needs. We have heard about the scramble for Africa, 1884-85. We decided, and we have decided unanimously, to put that colonial past behind us. But first, how did we in Norway bridge this gap which Ragnar talked about, which we in Norway even a couple of 100 years, 200 years back, lived in a kind of African wealth-like society? What did we do to get out of that and to bridge this gap? We lived in cottages like this. Our comparative advantage was over ice and snow. We actually sold ice to Europe. We sold timber. London is built on Norwegian timber. Netherlands is built on Norwegian timber. Our ships gathered in their midst ice down to Denmark and all the way down to Italy, actually. Okay? We had extractive industries, mining, with help from the Germans and the British to do that. We had high-tech industries in the 1900s. We stole technology. We built our ovens and furnaces and sewing machines. We built our waterways, our woodlands. And even today we are proud of living in wooden houses. The fisheries are under pressure, and still, as they did 200 years ago, helped us, not only giving us a raw material, but giving us an industry of fishing. Over to the right there, my grandfather sold in Gudbrandsdalen in the 30s and 40s and 50s, even before electricity was there. They warmed them up in the cities and they took them up to the valley to convince housewives that this is the future. This was made in Norway and Sweden. Mustafabrikker, fishing hooks, are sold all over the world. From poor Gjøvik, they found a way all over the world. We built our railroads. There should be some figures there, but it's in white. Some 700 tunnels, some 2,800 bridges. We spent more than one annual income, national income, on our railroad, only to Bergen. And we had a welfare state long before we had oil and wealth. We had national development policies. We agreed to spend our money jointly to do what was necessary. Setting national priorities is about using resources for the common good and controlling resource use. You couldn't buy a car in Norway before 1960. You had to be in need of a car for some reason. We got a car in 1965. We had tariffs on infant industries. We had subsidies to farmers. We had restrictions on land purchase. We had high tax on luxury goods. We had setting of national standards of education and so on, and we still have it. We built human capacity, University of Oslo, already in 1811, still 3 years before, or almost 100 years before we became an independent nation. Even as a colony, we had a university here. We had obligatory basic education from 1889, before we were a country. Today, 4 out of 5 have education beyond basic education. Our waterfalls belong to everyone. After 60 years, you have to give back the waterfall to the state. It belongs to the nationhood. Oil was founded late in 1969. And we had a chance of either using the oil as you do in Russia by creating 45 oligarchs, or you could put up a 4 billion Norwegian kroner pension fund. And at the base of this is a parliament that is accountable to the people. Labor unions are important for welfare states. And we had an agreement between labor and money people that if labor became more efficient, they were entitled to increase in income. Increased productivity will justify increase in wages. Okay. This was the introduction. Dag Hammarskjöld, his father, come to think of it, was called Hammarskjöld. His father was Prime Minister of Sweden in the times of hunger. So made jokes with him and called him Hammarskjöld. He was brought up in a castle in Uppsala, and outside the castle there's a portrait of him, or a statue of him. Africa, as we saw, there's a conference in Sweden this week called Africa is a Country. And people are protesting. Africa is not a country. Africa is many, many countries. How many countries have we now? 67? 52.
52.
54. 54 countries. And someone even today had the guts to call Africa a country. But Africa is vast. Look what we can get into the African continent. We can get China there, United States, Europe, India. This is Africa. This is the country of Africa. And think of the multitude of cultures, of people, of nature. But let's go to the past in which we cannot, and nobody has hinted that, but the past, the colonial past. The colonial past goes far way back, but it had a shifted gear in 1884, 85, when the Berlin Conference brought together some 20 countries, between 20 and 30 countries, came together and said, let's not fight over Africa, let's share Africa between us. And this is how the map looks. Nobody ever did that to the US. Nobody ever did that to Europe. This is Africa. Dag Hammarskjöld was working for the, well, let me stick to my manuscript so I don't sort of say things twice here. Dag Hammarskjöld was the second General Secretary of the UN. And his task was to form and shape this common family of nations. In the beginning, we had only sort of some 80 countries in the world. Today we are close to 200. But in his time it was somehow simpler. But he was frustrated to see that the countries that actually established the UN didn't want to give the UN power. And he said, many member nations of the United Nations have not yet accepted the very limits put on their national ambitions by the very existence of the United Nations and by the membership of that organization. What he tried to say was, if you're a member of the United Nations, you give up some of your independence. And he wasn't talking about failed states in Africa. He was talking about the United States, Britain, France, the Soviet Union. And once they found out that this guy meant what he said, they wanted him out of the UN General Secretary's seat. Sorry. Hammarskjöld had started working for the OEED. That was the institution that actually implemented the Marshall help to Europe after the war. So he was an expert in building Europe. And during the 50s, he saw the shaping of OECD, the rich man's club, which is still today working. But more than that, he saw the shaping of the DAC committee, the DAC committee, in the OECD, the Development Assistance Committee. Today there are 23 wealthy nations that are said to take special responsibility for development. It's the DAC organization, now headed by a Norwegian, Solheim, who in Paris defines what is good development aid. So if the Norwegian government wants to find out if it's good to use development aid for refugees in Norway, they go to Paris and ask Mr. Solheim and the company of 23 friends, and they say yes, it's okay for Norway to use development aid in Norway, and it's considered good development aid. Hammarskjöld said, putting DAC in front of development aid in Africa, or in front of development in Africa, is they're going to turn Africa into a happy hunting ground. This was 50 years ago. He said it's a very bad idea to put the countries, it's basically the same 23 countries that were gathered in Berlin in 1884-85. Mainly the same countries. Norway was there as part of Sweden. We were in Berlin, sharing Africa among us, or accepting the big countries to take parts of Africa. It's a bad idea, Hammarskjöld said, to let these countries that took Africa apart in 1884 to try to give Africa back its identities in 1960. 2 months after Hammarskjöld died, in September 1961, the DAC committee was established, and OECD was a fact also. We've been talking about the development goals, Millennium Development Goals. And we refer to them as the United Nations Development Goals. It's not the United Nations Development Goals. It was made in Paris by the DAC Committee in 1996, then turned into a World Bank policy called Better World for All, and in 2000 it was suddenly named, in September 2000, it was called the Millennium Development Goals. They're fully constructed in the North. There's never had an African, Asian, or Latin American voice in its shaping. And of course, the goals are okay, but they're limited. It's not as if they wanted to eliminate poverty. It's halve poverty. Thomas Pogge, you might have heard him in Oslo, had a very forceful explanation when he said, if we went to Hitler in 1940 and said, give us half the Jews, and we will give you pictures of smiling Jewish children. We don't do that. We do it with the poor in Africa. But it doesn't threaten the industrial world to combat AIDS, as long as you do not touch big pharma patent rights or develop medical companies in the South. It doesn't threaten industrial countries to feed the hungry, as long as you do not stop GMO foods and Western subsidized corn or wheat. It doesn't threaten industrial countries to teach reading and writing skills, as long as Africa does not engage in advanced research, high-tech production to compete with us. It doesn't threaten the industrial world to engage in world trade, as long as Africa does not use the same tools as we use to get rich: protection and infant industries, tariff barriers, subsidies, and a lot that I showed you about Norway. It doesn't threaten the industrial world to say it's okay with people's participation in democracy in the South, as long as it does not question the supremacy of the policies set by the World Bank and the Bretton Woods institutions, IMF, and the WTO. So today we have seen that the UN is being dismantled, underfinanced, and the focus is now on Davos in every January, where 1,000 billionaires invite celebrities and heads of state to discuss poverty in the luxury hills of Davos. And they distribute bed nets against malaria, which people use as fishing nets, and killing the fish with its poison. I say that we have to search for proactive, negative policies in Africa to find why people are still poor in Africa. And I'll show you one final thing. The rich countries' annual program for developing Africa is the OECD's Economic Outlook for Africa. Economic Outlook for Africa does not contain the word industry or manufacturing. It's not completely correct, because the last year it has introduced it. I think they have 18 instances of that word. But for 20 years, Economic Outlook for Africa pretend to be developing Africa without looking at industry. You would never dare to speak about, in a Norwegian election, talk about building Norway without talking about manufacturing, job creation, better wages, labor unions, and industry. The DAC countries have successfully managed to keep Africa a continued colonial area. Africa has continued to provide us with cheap raw materials. Africa has continued to not become a competitive power to the raw materials they have. And Africa has continued to not become a competitor on the finished goods market. Our policy towards Africa has been a great success. What is the future? Definitely, freedom from Africa will have to come from within. And I think one of the great professors in Africa today, Mahmoud Mamdani, at Makerere, coming from Colombia, and of course from Uganda, historically, he pointed to one important thing. He says Africa, to take control of Africa, will have to make the questions, to make the African questions, not to continue answering the questions of the consultants going to Africa. And as students, you know, it's when you toil with the questions you learn, not so much the answers. The answer is just the end product of a long process. So the fact that we've always been teaching Africa. Africa will take over. And Africa will have help in the near future from the BRICS bank being established as late as March this year. 100 billion US dollars are there to compete and to put the structural adjustment right. We haven't talked about structural adjustment, we could have gone on for 2 hours. But let me end up with this. Africa, future is about Africa posing the right questions. Thank you.